Okay, here we are with Magic Mountain, Chapter 6. Alright, so a little bit early. I kind of got through this part in 2 days. This chapter is a little bit different. Um, it starts about page, was it 519 or something? So it's, since, some new, what was, let's see, yeah, let me look at the front here. So we're getting down to the last chapter, so it's on 409. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so Walpurgis Night has happened, and this chapter, Walpurgis Night's an important chapter, and so is this chapter Snow. So let's read a little bit of the first part of chapter 6. It's called Changes. Sometimes at the beginning of the chapters, the narrator kind of is more involved. It's like um, kind of like this omniscient person. Like it's not because like a lot of the book, he kind of is from the point of view of Hans Castorp, but this one, he at least at the beginning, he kind of it's kind of the narrator talking to the reader here. What is time? A secret, insubstantial, and omnipotent, a prerequisite of the external world, a motion intermingled and fused with bodies existing and moving in space. But would there be no time if there were no motion? No motion if there were no time? What a question. Is this time a function of space or vice versa? Or are the two identical? An even bigger question. Time is active. By nature, it is much like a verb. It both ripens and brings forth. And what does it bring forth? Change. Now is not then, here is not there, both in both cases. For in both cases, motion lies in between. Since we measure time by a circular motion closed in on itself, we could just as easily say that its motion and change are rest and stagnation, for the then is constantly repeated in the now, and the there in the here. Moreover, since despite our best desperate attempts, we cannot imagine an end to come, end to time, or a finite border around space. We have decided to think of them as eternal and infinite, in the apparent belief that even if we are not totally successful, this marks some improvement. But does not the very positing of eternity and infinity imply the logical, mathematical negation of things limited and finite? Their relative reduction to zero is a sequence of events possible in eternity, a juxtaposition of objects in infinity. How does our makeshift assumption of eternity and infinity square with concepts like distance, motion, change, or even the existence of a finite body in space? Now, there's a real question for you. Hans Castorp turned these sort of questions over and over in his mind, a mind that, since his arrival up here, has tended to quibble and think indiscreet thoughts of this sort, and had perhaps been especially honed and emboldened for grumbling by a naughty but overwhelming desire for which he had now paid dearly. He asked himself these questions, asked good Joachim, even asked the valley buried under snow now since time out of mind. Although he certainly never heard anything resembling an answer from any party, hard to say which was the least helpful. In fact, he asked himself such questions only because he could not find answers. It was almost impossible to engage Joachim's interest in these matters since he thought of nothing, as Hans Castorp had himself noted one evening in French, except being a soldier down in the plains and lived in the increasingly bitter conflict with his hopes, which teased him by now drawing nearer, now vanishing in the distance. Indeed, of late, he seemed inclined to end the struggle with one decisive blow. Yes, good, patient, honest Joachim, a man given totally to service and discipline, was subject to attacks of insubordination rising up against the Gafke scale and analytic method by which people down in the laboratory, or as it's usually called, the lab, ascertained and specified the degree to which a patient was infected. And it gets into like some kind of medical stuff. So, yeah, like Castorp is thinking of Joachim, they're writing, and then he kind of returns. So let's talk about what happens in this chapter. Now that Walpurgis night is over and Claudia Couchat has departed, Castorp takes off the fool's cap she put on his head and returns to studying botany. Left with nothing but Claudia's farewell present and the framed X-ray portrait of her upper body, he slowly moves away from her and further up the path towards self-awareness. Now the path will lead steeply upward, and Castorp will reach its high point during the snow adventure. Sepertini, of course, is unable to see that it is not a it is not only in spite of, but because of his involvement with Claudia, and that Hans resumes his search for knowledge and insight. Sepertini's understanding of Castorp's education doesn't go beyond the critical inquiry of how Hans enjoyed the pomegranate of sensuality, suggesting that one who has tasted the fruit of perdition is irretrievably lost. More than ever, Sepertini now appears as the moralist and rationalist par excellence, one who dismisses disease as mere illusion, the result of a lack of reason. In this context, it is interesting to note that Sepertini never actually meets Claudia, the embodiment of what he battles against. Uh, just how obstinate Sepertini is becomes clear when he, convinced of his hopeless condition, says that he will move into the Davos. He would move into the town of Davos to complete his work for the encyclopedia. The subject of his contribution, it will be remembered, amounts to attempting to conquer disease and death by denying his existence. If Sepertini represents a purely ethical approach to life, the equally intellectual Napa, whom he introduces to the cousins, represents the purely aesthetic one. Extremely intense and lost in their respective positions, these two adversaries charge this sanatorium atmosphere with sheer mental brilliance. There is one trait in Naphtha that makes him radically different from Sepertini. As an intellectual, Naphtha is doomed by his irrational mentality to fight his rationality. This renders him a living paradox, which he will be driven to solve eventually by committing suicide. So Naphtha, this is a chapter he shows up and so this is like we're almost 400, 500 pages into this book, and a new character, and then even the next chapter, and then yet another character shows up. Okay, Naphtha exerts a greater influence on Hans Castorp than Sepertini because our hero, in a way of embodiment of both his educators, is sensitive enough to respond to this tension in the newcomer. It is that part of Naphtha he cannot grasp which fascinates him most, thus proving Naphtha's point of that humanity always tends to be drawn to the irrational elements rather than those that lend people to rational elements. So yeah, the whole idea that um real smart men, teachers, just kind of giving you advice, rationality, this is um in a kind of dogmatic way, that's like it's kind of like medicine. You hold your nose like what was it? Those old medicines where you hold your nose, and it's kind of like that. But irrationality, madness, as for young people, like seems like a better antidote, and stuff. So, like, think about that. Think about like what in your life. Why are we? Why are we? Uh, Attracted to irrational things, sentimental things that have no basis in reality. Whereas, like, the whole, like, I mean, it's like, we know we all die. We know that death awaits us. We know that it's cold in the Arctic. We know the sea is warm. We know, the sky's blue, the earth is round. But why do people like think about are attracted to irrational things, to emotional things, that to madness, craziness, crazy behavior? Why is that? I mean, why are humans into that? Okay, all this endless discussion between Separatini and NAFTA deal with the question of whether or not a monistic principle prevails in the cosmos, as the Italian contends, or whether spirit and matter are engaged in internal conflict as two autonomous forces, as the Spaniard claims. It is important to understand that aestheticism is related, in man's view, with disease and ultimately death. This is also part of Schopenhauer's ultra romantic philosophy in a nutshell, the purely aesthetic, sensual, and mystical mode of life as the great temptation towards death, the final consoler. The discussions of NAFTA and Separatini cover a wide variety of subjects, beginning with politics and soon evolving theology. Separatini argues that the natural law alone is the basis of democracy, whereupon NAFTA applies that the concept of the natural law is but a mutilation of divine law, and that the so-called democratic ideal is merely the last attempt of the West to fend off the new order already building up in the East. When the Spaniard learns that Separatini is a Freemason, he does not hesitate to call this organization a surrogate for the church, and claims its success is not the result of a principle of enlightenment it cherishes, but of mystical rituals. At one point, when Castorp is overwhelmed by a beautiful 14th century pieta, Napta, to whom it belongs, says it is natural for Hans to be overwhelmed because only spiritual beauty reaches real intensity. Separatini counters that he prefers Greco-Roman art with its balanced proportions to Gothic art, with all its emphasis on physical distortion and the interest of the spiritual. In reality, the Italian continues, Nafta's exaggerated enjoyment of the Pieta's expression of pain illustrates his desire for the experience of the purely physical. Suffering always intensifies his experience, often to the point of a perverted sensuality. Nafta, uh, NAFTA's sympathy with disease even makes him argue that the sick people of the world would lose their status of priority in life, and the healthy ones their best chance to gain salvation through practicing charity if there were no misery. Separatini defends rationality to absurd point, claiming to have healed insane people merely by looking at them rationally. The relationship between aesthetic appreciation, sensuality, and death is an integral part to Castorp's gradual spiritual growth, as was demonstrated most explicitly by in the study of pathology and Baron's sinister role in it. From the Pieta, the discussion of the two men switches to the Inquisition, whose cruelties Separatini cites to make Castorp think twice about Napta's ideas on suffering. The Spaniard retorts, however, that even the worst tortures of the Inquisition were committed to save souls, something that cannot be said of the butchering of the French Aconites who were convinced that when they killed a man, they killed all of them, body and soul, for good. Naphtha corners Sepertini by telling him that if he understood the essence of the Inquisition, he would know that the rationalists of his Sepertini's kind instituted it. More than ever before, Mann demonstrates through familiarity with medieval philosophy and that of its forerunner, St. Augustine, the heading of the city of God is a direct translation of St. Augustine's masterpiece, and deliverance by evil reflects his concept of a felix culpa, literally happy guilt, whose essence is the deliverance. Is that whose essence is that deliverance can come through sin and subsequent repentance. These ideas run through the entire novel, and although they are never wrapped in religious terminology, Mann justifies Castorp's disease as a prerequisite for his growing maturities. When Sepertini carries on about the merits of the rationalistic work ethic of the West, Naphtha comes back at him by explaining the teachings of Bernard of Clairvaux, the 12th century theologian. His symbiology of human's progress towards perfection, which was a progression towards pure contemplation, was Western too. This is, too, of course, the main point Naphtha wants to make. So let's see where we are here. Okay. So yeah, this is a long chapter. It's the it's the most because you got Sepertini and Naphtha, so they're just talking, and hence Castorp's like taking it in. The trouble is neither that Sepertini nor Naphtha really understands Clairvaux. For Sepertini, the dawn of humanity begins with the Renaissance at best, really with the French Revolution. His mind is therefore incapable of comprehending the full meaning of a symbol, negating any non-rational component within him. A symbol remains inaccessible to him. All he gets out of Clairvaux is a cheap distortion of the symbol of the bed of repose, standing for communication with God. Here we have an aspect of Sepertini which is too easily overlooked. He too has strong touches of sensuality about him, but he does not grant them room. Like disease, he simply suppresses the urge for sex. And when its pressures become too strong, he transfers his reaction to the levels of jokes. In this connection, the reader may recall some of his crude approaches to female patients at the very beginning, which caused Castorp to call him a windbag. Denying humanity's central level of existence, he is bound to be a prude. Naphtha, on the other hand, reacts in the other extreme. Although well versed in theology, he too is a victim of his extreme and therefore wrong position. He cannot derive anything but voluptuousness from the spirit dwelling in the body. Naphtha's voluptuousness again becomes apparent when he questions Sepertini as to whether monism does not bore him. Humanity, according to Naphtha, whose name incidentally is also that of a flammable volatile liquid, does not long for liberty but for terror. Communism, of which early Christianity availed itself, may not get along very well with uh, Catholicism, he argues, although the two are opposites in terms of their beliefs. His views, always preferring some form of error to compromise, are rooted in his conviction that death is an independent force. At Joachim's deathbed, he goes so far as to assert that virtue can not be where there is no reason, nor has religion anything to do with reason and morals, because it has nothing to do with life. What keeps drawing the two adversaries toward each other may also be expressed in terms of what they lack. Sepertini's deficiency is that he lacks an entire sphere of human existence, the intuitive or spiritual one, and Naphtha's flaw is he only lives in this sphere. By carrying their deficiencies to absurd extremes, each of these men forfeits his own standpoint, which up to the point makes sense. Mann stresses the futility. Thomas Mann stresses the futility of their intellectualism in the face of the ultimate reality, a reality which kills both Separtini and Naphtha. Castorp is fascinated by their brilliance, but he has matured enough to realize the countless contradictions within each system, much less between the systems and the men advocating them. He gradually arrives at a more harmonious view of the world. When Joachim insists that they did not come to Davos to get wiser but healthier, Hans reminds them that these inconsistencies are only superficial ones and that they should ought to be reconciled. Dividing up the world into two hostile camps, Castorp chides his cousin this grievous error, most reprehensible. As implied above, NAFTA's views are not all wrong, as indeed Separatinis are not all wrong, while what the Spaniard propagates is wrong only that is it is carried to self-defeating extremes. Suffering and disease may indeed intensify experience beyond that which is accessible to the healthy and the normal. The disease organism, as Castorp's case it illustrates, may be more restless and therefore more eager to learn, more sensitive and therefore more capable of learning, closer to physical dissolution and therefore more spiritualized. NAFTA's failure does not consist in preaching these basically true aspects of life, but raising them to positions of exclusiveness. There's little doubt, for instance, that the vast majority of people really need some kind of authority, more certainly than Cipriani thinks, who judges people by his own demands for freedom. Freedom, however, is no absolute good, nor is anything else if elevated to exclusiveness. Although NAFTA is right in principle, he fails here because he winds up advocating outright terror. Thus, Mann takes sides neither with Separtini nor with NAFTA, but remains eager to advocate the ideal of aloofness with all extremes. As a result, his approach is essentially ironic. Irony keeps him from the danger of seeing somebody and something only from a certain angle and only at a given moment. Man is a great believer in the exclusive quality of reality, and he prefers to depict its myriad scintillating moods rather than a supply system of neat little tags. Hereditary and environmental factors, which man emphasizes as most instrumental in forming man, enhance this irony. Their discussion is resumed here at precisely the points where NAFTA is about to drive home an idea to Separtini or Castorp. It immediately reduces NAFTA to the level of a product of his heritage, his Jewish ancestors, the cruel customs of his native Poland, and the accident that led him to Catholicism. Spanish and the Eastern characteristics of man's ethnic system are accountable for NAFTA's irrationality, cruelty, and sympathy with disease and death. We have seen that each the novel's characters is described in one term or another, or often in the opposites. One of these sets of characters is Hans Castorp and his cousin Joachim Zeisman. Now, more than ever, we can measure Castorp's growing self-awareness and confusion by the increasingly violent reactions of Joachim here. Joachim responds to his cousin growing interest in botany, for instance, by telling him he understands less than ever before. If Castorp gets tired of the intellectual fireworks of his discussion partners, he nevertheless derives insight from them. This is not true of Joachim. All he remembers of these discussions is NAFTA's Jewish nose, typical of a mind that judges by racial characteristics essentially different, and must be stressed from man's ideas on ethnically conditioned modes of behavior. Joachim refuses to think because thinking only confuses matters. Again, man's irony forbids him to side with Castorp against his cousin. The purely intellectual approach to life is quickly shown to be inadequate, and using the farcical suicide later on, even as self-destructive. The situation between the cousin climaxes when Castorp explains to Joachim that the sudden unusual change in the weather is merely an outward sign of the unusual state of affairs on the Magic Mountain. Joachim's impatience with Hans erupts because the latter has matured enough to accept the change. Once upon a time, the reader will recall our hero was utterly confused by the unusual climate. Joachim makes plans to leave, demanding that barons let him return to the army because he is a military man to his core. He departs. Before Joachim leaves, however, he implores Hans to follow him where there is still time. He even calls Hans by his first name. Sapertini, too, will call him by his first name at the outbreak of the war. Hans does get Baron's permission to leave, but then refuses to go. Irony plays a important role in Joachim's life. He, who has literally lived for the day he would be permitted to return to the world of law and order, is forced to give it up again because of his failing health. And to make things worse, he has to return to the sanatorium just when the maneuvers, a symbol of strict obedience to authority, are about to begin. Not only his serious attacks, but also his behavior, his overly reserved treatment of his girlfriend, Mariusha, for instance, indicate his death is near. Nothing can keep him, however, from formally applying for extension of his leave. Never has he ceased to be a deeply committed man. Eerily and symbolically enough, the beard growing around his dying face gives him the added likeness of an honorable warrior. It is true that Joachim has been sick all along, but he contracted his death blow while he was with his unit down below. He is a victim of fanatical call of duty, and honor was the death of him, as the cynical Baron sums it up. Appropriately, he is buried in a soldier's grave, pierced by roots, the roots which never permitted him to become exposed to any flights of fancy. He is responsible for his own death, but contentment and harmony on his deathbed are the reward for his moral life. Joachim is, as our hero will explain to Claudia, the prototype of the kind who travels the direct, regular, and honest path to life. There are other confrontations besides that between the cousins, which exemplify the degree which Hans Castorp has become part and parcel of the sanatorium world. Uncle Tianapple arrival at his sudden departures and his sudden departure served no other purpose than to show the futility of his attempt to retrieve our renegade hero. It also illustrates convincingly how James Tianapple, like every other sensitive newcomer, becomes inevitably embroiled in the lures of the magic mountain and would, if he stayed, be privileged and condemned to share his nephew's fate. In fact, this new ambassador of the Flatlands goes through the same dizzying experience Hans once went through. And the heavy tongue, the feverish head, and the protruding veins all seem, in Baron's opinion, to indicate that he's sick enough to stay up here. Although his uncle's sexual excitement mounts, and as was the case with Hans long ago, he shows it not by approaching a centrally attractive lady patient, but by asking Berens to describe the process of physical decomposition to him. The thematic motif of the affinity between sensuality and an exaggerated concern for the body's origin and makeup is taken up once again as one more parallel sensation, which we remember from Hans' earlier days. Uncle Tianapple's sense of time becomes vague and his self assurance begins to dwindle. Hans Castorp fully understands his uncle's reactions as though those of initial adjustment, even though he is beyond them now. New insights have slowly led him away from the deep sensuality of his days with Claudia. The fact that she is away has, of course, helped him, and his concept of time has lost its haunting vagueness because he has become used to it. We don't feel the cold is a stereotype with which he counters his uncle complaints, emphasizing the difference standard of his mountain world and his loyalty to them. Like Walpurgis Night, the section entitled Snow warrants separate treatment. As far as Hans Castorp's educational process is concerned, the two sections are opposite. Snow brings Castorp's temporary attainment of his ideal whereas Walpurgis Night brought a temporary abandonment of the ideal. Both scenes are perfect battlefields for the forces of reason and sensuality in Castorp's life. And as in Walpurgis Night, Sepertini's warning, the very words he shouted after Hands at the Carnival, and Claudia Caccia's enticements here in the form of recurring mention of the pencil motif play a leading role in this battle. These warnings and enticements are products of Castorp's overwrought imagination, merely heightens their vividness and increases their effect. The present scene, with all its hallucinations and visions superimposed over another, drawn together by leitmotifs and whirling around in emerging circular concept of time, reflects as a microcosm the scintillating macrocosm of the whole magic mountain world. Our hero's wanderings among his marvels of this world are condensed here in the hike away from the Berghoff and his almost fatal entanglements with nature. Let's see where we are. Okay, so 30 minutes. We're almost done here. Okay, maybe another 5 minutes. Okay, so blah 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 blah. Okay, fascinated by the phasmagatorial landscape of an unusually deep winter, Castorp decides to learn how to ski so he can venture to higher altitudes. The sub theme of snow symbolizing death finds its most explicit expression in Castorp's musing about snowflakes as too symmetrical and therefore opposed to the principle of life. He has outgrown his teacher, Sepertini's notion of life as something regular, consistent, and purely rational. On the contrary, his studies of nature have shown him that these qualities are uh, represented purest in or inorganic nature. At the same time, he loves snow and enjoys it with extremely defiant attitude. Hans is aware of his growing distance from the sanatorium, but he continues to climb and dismisses his own misgivings as cowardice. His voracious appetite for primitive nature triggers the association with Claudia Couchot in him, thus demonstrating that his craving for the experience of nature is but another form of sensuality. He has never ceased to toy with the forces so great that to approach them nearly is destruction. This is, this is Schopenhauer's philosophy about the inviting, soothing quality of death. Yet, it is Schopenhauer about to be overcome by Goethe's life asserting humanism in the ensuing vision. The vision that had Castorp has while standing up against the cabin is the most comprehensive and profound of his many intrusions in the mysteries of life and death. More lucidly than the other one, it affords him a glimpse into the dual nature of human existence and quickly leads him on towards his triumph, the transcendence of dualism. That it springs directly from his exhaustion is consistent with the idea dominant throughout the novel that disease and suffering are, in the last analysis, positive forces serving spiritual growth, provided that they are not granted independent apart from life. Not white, gray, and black, but green, blue, and gold are the colors of the world of perfect harmony. Hans sees glimpses of a luxuriant park where he watches the serene children of the sun, mythical figures symbolizing life asserting forces, play among antique buildings and mingle in Castorp's mind with faint memories of happy holidays at the Mediterranean. Hans Castorp knows he has glimpsed into the future state of social bliss, but also into what Sepertini terms cultural backsliding, which always lurks behind it. The scene is highly symbolic. The countless allusions to the Mediterranean civilization, the Italian tenor, the mention Naples, Sicily, Greece suggests man's belief in the rational and peaceful quality of Western life, and the moss covered and weathered temples, the statues, eye sockets, and the gray witches, suggesting the decayed world of political reaction. The sunny and shady sides of the temples represent the dual aspects of man, his reason and his irrationality. What is new about the dream is the purely negative aspect of death and its disgust, which Castorp treats it. There is not one. There is not a trace left of his temptation to surrender to it that he displayed only a few minutes ago. Pondering his vision, Castorp realized that man dreams not individually but also communally. That he who knows the body, that is life, also knows death. That all interest in disease and death is only an expression of interest in life. In short, that man is a master of opposites just as he is their inventor. He now sees the utter sterility of intellectual efforts of Steppertini and Napta, neither of whom will be able to solve anything without the spark of love. It cannot be man's task to fight life in the name of unbridled reason or to throw humanity back into barbarism by advocating the abandonment of all reasons. Since abstract systems can only be born of man, he must be superior to them. Thus, Castor now vows to side with man, who is alone worth fighting for, and let death have no sovereignty over his thoughts. Castorp, it seems, has accomplished his goals, yet his supreme insight turns out to be a little more than a fleeting moment's caper. We hear that even the same evening, it was no longer so clear as it had been at first. Is our hero's moment of triumph perhaps only the result of a is our hero's moment uh, of triumph perhaps only the result of wishful thinking, part of his dream of thoughts that linger after the actual vision is over? A number of questions arise here. Can Hans Castor realistically be expected to develop his insights steadily or consistently without backsliding? Does he fail to live up to the ultimate goal or his ultimate vision because the task is superhuman? Even as we exonerate Castor from the charge of deliberate irresponsibility, the nagging feeling remains that he has failed and that his failure is somehow connected with the impotent in the facing of decisions. Confronted with endless alternatives, he never really makes a choice. When he sometimes comes close to making one, he does not stick to it or act it out. He conspicuously lacks the capability of putting his insights to use. His unwillingness to commit himself gradually turns into a tragic inability to do so. Throughout his educational history, Castorp is encouraged by his educators to devote his efforts to some cause. Yet, Hans embraced the very opposites, aloofness and non involvement. This was also, of course, Thomas Mann's intention. Castorp learned so well that he overshoots the limit. As a result, Hans is suspended between yes and no. This was the author's ironical intention. It shows that every idea, including that of aloofness and non involvement, will inevitably work against humanity if carried to extremes. Hence, Castorp education does not and cannot proceed in a linear fashion, being the medium in which all experience, including that of the journey, take place. A journey of education takes place. Time can be no linear continuum. At the outset, it will be remembered the aspect of time was the one that Castor believed in, studying the orbits of stars and musing how the millenniums ago the ancients engaged in the same pursuits. He now concludes that time must consist of circular motion. This view of time as perennial recurrence of events already exemplified by Kestorp's wandering around in circles, prevails in this chapter. It leads to the realization that a succession of events is possible in the circular medium. Okay, so that's chapter 6. It took us almost 40 minutes to get through it. It's a long chapter. There's a lot of talk, and it's definitely worth rereading. And there it is. Okay, so we'll probably get to, today's Sunday, so probably by next Sunday we'll probably finished chapter 7, the final chapter. It's about I think it's about 200 plus pages. Okay, we'll talk to you then. We'll see you next week, next Sunday.